There is a moment in every human relationship, romantic, professional, familial, when one person holds all the power simply because they are present and the other holds none because they are available. You have felt this. You have been on both sides of it. And if you are honest with yourself, you already know which side felt stronger. I've spent my life studying power, not the power of armies or thrones, but the quieter, more devastating power that operates in silence. And nothing generates more raw psychological force than the well-timed disappearance. Think of the lover who withdraws just as you begin to feel secure. Think of the mentor who stops answering your calls the moment you started depending on them. Think of the empire that goes quiet before it strikes. This is not neglect. This is not weakness. This is strategy, ancient, brutal, and devastatingly effective. Human beings are addicted to certainty. We crave the constant, the reliable, the always available. But the moment something becomes reliable, it becomes invisible. We stop noticing what stays. We only notice what leaves. This is the paradox at the heart of what I call the dark psychology of disappearing. Absence is not the opposite of power. It is one of its purest forms. In the next 6 parts, I will take you through the anatomy of this weapon, how the great seducers, strategists, and manipulators of history have used vanishing as a tool of dominance, how your own nervous system betrays you the moment someone you rely on goes silent, and, most importantly, how to recognize when it is being used against you before it reshapes your mind entirely. This is not a theory. This is how power has always worked in the shadows. Nature, as the old philosophers understood, abhors a vacuum. So does the human psyche. The moment something disappears from your life, a lover, a friend, an opportunity, your mind does not simply accept the absence. It rushes to fill it, obsessively, compulsively, often with far more energy than it ever gave the thing while it was present. This is the first and most fundamental law of disappearing. Removal creates more psychological gravity than presence ever could. Consider how the mind treats abundance versus scarcity. When something is constantly available to you, your brain stops allocating attention to it. This is simple neurological economy. The brain does not waste resources monitoring what it can always access. But the instant that thing becomes uncertain, unavailable, or absent, the brain reclassifies it as a threat to resource security. It becomes urgent. It becomes, quite literally, an obsession. This is why the person who calls you every day and the person who suddenly stops calling occupy 2 entirely different psychological categories in your mind, even though the second person has, in objective terms, done less to you. They have done nothing. And that nothing consumes you. I studied this dynamic extensively in The Art of Seduction, where I described the adrenaline of absence. The seducer who creates the most powerful longing is rarely the one who gives the most. It is the one who, at the precise moment of emotional investment, disappears, leaving the target to complete the seduction in their own mind alone, with no resistance to argue against the fantasy they are now constructing. This is the cruelty and the genius of the tactic. When someone disappears, you are no longer negotiating with them. You are negotiating with your own imagination, and your imagination has no limits. History is filled with rulers and strategists who understood this instinctively long before psychology had a name for it. Consider the diplomatic silences of Talleyrand, the master manipulator of post-revolutionary France, who served under Napoleon, then abandoned him at the precise moment his fortunes turned. Talleyrand's genius was not merely betrayal, it was timing. He vanished from alliances exactly when his absence would be most destabilizing, and reappeared exactly when his presence would be most valuable. He treated relationships the way a general treats troop movements, visibility and invisibility as instruments of strategy, not accidents of circumstance. Or consider how empires themselves have used strategic withdrawal. An army that retreats without explanation forces its enemy into paranoia. Was it weakness or was it a trap? The uncertainty itself becomes a weapon, forcing the opponent to expend resources preparing for threats that may or may not materialize. Sun Tzu understood this 3,000 years ago. All warfare is based on deception, and the deepest deception is not what you show, it is what you withhold. Now bring this down to the intimate, everyday scale of your own life. The colleague who suddenly stops including you in conversations. The romantic partner who takes hours, then days, to respond to a message they used to answer instantly. The parent whose approval you once had unconditionally, who now seems distracted, distant, elsewhere. In every case, your mind performs the same calculation whether you are aware of it or not. What did I do? What changed? How do I get it back? This is the trap. The question itself, how do I get it back, is already a surrender of power. You have shifted from being a person with your own center of gravity to being a satellite orbiting someone else's absence. I want you to notice something important here. Disappearing works not because of what the disappearing person actually feels or intends, but because of what your own mind constructs in the silence. A person who has genuinely lost interest and a person who is strategically manufacturing longing produce in your nervous system an almost identical response. This is what makes the tactic so dangerous and so easily exploited by those who understand it. The ancient Greeks had a concept for this. Kairos, the opportune moment. Disappearance wielded with skill is entirely a matter of kairos. Vanish too early before any investment has been made, and you are simply forgotten. Vanish too late after the relationship has calcified into comfortable stability, and your absence barely registers. But vanish at the precise inflection point, just as attachment is forming, just as dependency is taking root, and you create a psychological wound that the other person will spend enormous energy trying to heal, usually by chasing you. This is why, throughout history, the most seductive figures, the courtesans of Renaissance Italy, the political operators of every royal court, the cult leaders who commanded absolute devotion, have all, in their own way, mastered the rhythm of presence and absence, never fully available, never fully gone, always slightly out of reach. Understand this law and you begin to see it everywhere. The parent who withholds affection to control a child, and the boss who becomes suddenly cold to keep employees anxious and compliant, in the friend who disappears from your life the moment you needed them most, not out of malice necessarily, but often out of an unconscious understanding that presence is cheap and absence is expensive. Here is something that will unsettle you. Rejection in its purest form is often easier for the human mind to process than disappearance. A clear no gives you information, it gives you closure. It allows your mind to file the experience away and move forward. Disappearance denies you this mercy entirely. When someone rejects you outright, the story ends. When someone disappears, the story simply stops. Mid-sentence, mid-scene, and your mind, unable to tolerate an unfinished narrative, begins writing the rest of it itself, usually in the most self-flagellating way possible. This is rooted in something psychologists call the Zeigarnik effect. Our minds retain unfinished tasks and unresolved experiences with far more intensity than completed ones. An open loop consumes mental resources in a way a closed loop never does. Disappearance is the ultimate open loop. There is no ending to process, only an absence to endlessly reinterpret. I have written extensively about the psychology of the elusive object of desire, the person, the goal, the opportunity that seems always slightly beyond reach. What I want to make clear here is the mechanism beneath this. Your brain does not distinguish cleanly between longing and threat. Both activate similar neural circuitry. Heightened vigilance, obsessive monitoring, difficulty concentrating on anything else. This is why heartbreak from disappearance so often resembles a kind of low-grade trauma, even when no cruelty was ever explicitly enacted upon you. Consider the historical pattern of the beloved absent ruler, a phenomenon that recurs across nearly every monarchy in history. Kings and queens who made themselves scarce, who were seen rarely and glimpsed only in carefully staged appearances, were almost universally more revered than those who were constantly visible and accessible to their subjects. Louis XIV understood this instinctively at Versailles. His elaborate rituals of visibility and invisibility, His carefully staged appearances and retreats transformed mere presence into performance and performance into myth. The court did not merely obey him. They ached for proximity to him precisely because that proximity was rationed. Compare this to a ruler who is constantly present, constantly accessible, constantly explaining himself. Such a figure quickly becomes ordinary in the mind of his subjects. Overexposure is the death of power. Every leader, every seducer, every parent who has ever wondered why their constant attention seems to earn so little gratitude should sit with this truth. Familiarity dissolves reverence, and reverence is the raw material of influence. Now let us turn this lens towards something more painful and more universal, the disappearance of a parent's emotional presence during childhood. This is in many ways the origin template for how adults respond to absence for the rest of their lives. A child whose caregiver is inconsistent, sometimes warm, sometimes cold, sometimes present, sometimes emotionally gone, does not learn to stop seeking connection. They learn the opposite. They learn to increase their pursuit, to become hyper-vigilant to the caregiver's moods, to develop what attachment researchers call an anxious, preoccupied style. A nervous system permanently primed to chase inconsistency, mistaking intensity for intimacy. This is why so many adults find themselves, against all logic, more drawn to people who are emotionally unavailable than to those who are steady and present. It is not masochism. It is pattern recognition, imprinted early, operating far below conscious thought. The person who disappears and returns is unconsciously recreating the exact rhythm that once taught your nervous system that love must be earned through vigilance and anxiety. Those who understand dark psychology, whether instinctively like the natural seducer or deliberately like the calculating manipulator, exploit this template ruthlessly. They do not need to study attachment theory to use it. They simply notice, through trial and error or cold observation, that inconsistency produces obsession far more reliably than consistency produces gratitude. And once they notice this, if they lack conscience, they will use it without hesitation. I want to draw a crucial distinction here, because it separates the strategist from the merely cruel. The master of this dynamic does not disappear randomly or destructively. Randomness produces chaos and eventually distrust so severe that the target disengages entirely to protect themselves. The master disappears with precision, always leaving a thread, however thin, that suggests eventual return. A single message after days of silence, a brief reappearance after a long absence, warm enough to reignite hope, brief enough to leave you wanting more. This is the architecture of what behavioral psychologists call a variable ratio reinforcement schedule. The same mechanism, incidentally, that makes gambling addictive. You are not rewarded every time you play. You are rewarded unpredictably. And it is the unpredictability itself that hooks you far more deeply than consistent reward ever could. This is why disappearance, when wielded by someone who understands its mechanics, is more addictive to the human nervous system than steady affection. It is not despite the pain that people chase it. It is because of the pain, because pain paired with intermittent relief is the most potent psychological hook ever discovered, older than any drug, older than any technology coded into us since infancy. Understand this, and you begin to see the outline of a dark truth. Those who disappear strategically are not always acting from indifference. Often they are acting from a precise, almost surgical understanding of exactly how much absence a particular person's psychology can tolerate before the obsession sets in, and exactly when to reappear before it breaks entirely. Every era produces its masters of disappearance, individuals who, whether through natural instinct or cold calculation, understood that the surest path to psychological dominance was not through relentless presence, but through the strategic manipulation of their own visibility. Let us begin with the courtesans of history, figures who, denied formal political power, became experts instead in the subtler power of desire. The great courtesans of Renaissance Venice and 18th century Paris did not succeed by being endlessly available to the men who desired them. They succeeded by being managed, visible at precisely calculated intervals, absent just long enough to prevent familiarity from curdling into boredom. Ninon de l'Enclos, one of the most celebrated courtesans of 17th century France, maintained the devotion of powerful men for decades, not through youth or constant availability, but through an almost theatrical control of her own presence. She disappeared from social circles at the height of her popularity, only to return when anticipation had reached its peak. Her absences were not accidents. They were performances as deliberate as any speech or gesture. Contrast this with the tragic outcome awaiting those who never learn this lesson, those who give everything, who are endlessly present, endlessly available, endlessly explaining and pursuing. Such people are rarely remembered as powerful, however genuine their affection. They are remembered as needy, and neediness, in the theater of human relationships, is the single most repellent quality a person can display. This is not fair. It is simply how the human mind, wired by millions of years of evolution to value scarce resources over abundant ones, processes presence and absence. Now consider a darker architect of this dynamic, the cult leader. Nearly every documented cult, from Jonestown to more contemporary examples, relied on a specific and repeatable pattern involving the leader's calculated absence. The leader is not endlessly present to followers. Instead, followers experience periods of intense closeness, retreats, gatherings, moments of direct attention, followed by periods where the leader withdraws, becomes inaccessible, communicates only through intermediaries or not at all. This oscillation is not incidental to cult psychology. It is central to it. The withdrawal creates desperate craving for the leader's return, and that craving is then exploited. Followers compete for scrap attention, interpret any reappearance as validation, and become willing to sacrifice enormous amounts of autonomy, money, and independent judgment simply to reclaim the closeness they once had. This same architecture appears in miniature in far more mundane corners of life. Consider the modern workplace and the executive who becomes suddenly coldly distant from a subordinate who was previously receiving warm mentorship. This is rarely random. Often it is, consciously or not, a method of reasserting hierarchy, of reminding the subordinate that access to the executive's time and approval is a privilege, not a right, and privileges can be revoked. The subordinate, desperate to understand what went wrong, works harder, becomes more compliant, more eager to please. Precisely the outcome the withdrawal was designed, consciously or unconsciously, to produce. Consider also the political operator. And here I return to a figure I studied closely in my earlier work, Otto von Bismarck, who mastered the art of strategic unavailability in diplomacy. Bismarck understood that a nation, like a person, becomes less valuable in negotiation the more eager it appears to reach agreement. His diplomatic silences, refusing correspondence, delaying responses, withdrawing from negotiations at critical moments, were not signs of disinterest. They were calculated pressure tactics designed to make rival powers anxious, uncertain, and ultimately more willing to concede ground simply to end the uncertainty. What unites all these figures, the courtesan, the cult leader, the executive, the statesman, is a shared understanding of a principle that most people never consciously articulate. Presence is a resource, and like any resource, its value is determined by scarcity. Those who understand this treat their own attention, affection, and availability the way a central bank treats currency, carefully regulated, never oversupplied, released strategically to maximize its effect. But I must be clear about something crucial here, because this is where the truly dark version of this psychology reveals itself. There is a vast difference between a person who naturally maintains healthy boundaries, who has their own life, their own pursuits, and is not neurotically available, and a person who manufactures absence deliberately as a manipulation tactic, weaponizing another person's attachment system against them for personal gain, control, or ego gratification. The first is simply a psychologically healthy human being. The second is engaging in something closer to psychological warfare. whether or not they would ever describe it that way to themselves. And here is the deeply unsettling truth. Most people who use this tactic manipulatively do not think of themselves as manipulators at all. They believe sincerely that they are simply taking space or not chasing or protecting their peace. Language that conveniently obscures the calculated effect their withdrawal has on the person left behind. This is the essential danger of dark psychology in general. Its practitioners rarely announce themselves. They do not think of themselves as villains. They think of themselves as simply doing what works. I want to take you now into the interior experience of the person left behind, because understanding this experience from the inside is the only way to ever inoculate yourself against it. The first stage, almost universally, is disbelief. The mind refuses at first to accept the new reality of absence. It searches for alternate explanations. They are busy, their phone died, something happened. This is temporary. This is not naivety. It is a basic protective mechanism, the same one that allows people to function during the early stages of grief before the full weight of loss has been processed. The mind cannot absorb catastrophic change all at once. It must be metabolized gradually. The second stage is hypervigilant reconstruction. Here the mind begins compulsively replaying recent interactions, searching for the precise moment where things shifted, the sentence that was misread, the gesture that was misunderstood. This process feels like problem solving, but it is rarely productive because it operates on an assumption that is almost always false, that there is a clean, discoverable logical explanation that once found will restore control. In reality, human motivations are frequently murky even to the people holding them. But the abandoned mind cannot tolerate this uncertainty. So it manufactures certainty, usually in the form of self-blame, because self-blame, however painful, at least offers the illusion of control. If it was my fault, then I can fix it. If it was random or beyond my understanding, I am powerless. This is precisely why disappearance is so much more corrosive to self-esteem than direct rejection. Direct rejection locates the causes outside your control, a mismatch, a preference, a circumstance. Disappearance, by offering no explanation at all, invites your mind to supply the most damning explanation available. Something about you specifically was insufficient. The third stage is obsessive pursuit, or, in those who suppress the urge to pursue, obsessive rumination, which is simply pursuit turned inward. This is the stage where behavior often becomes genuinely irrational. Checking a phone every few minutes, rereading old messages for hidden meaning, constructing and deleting messages that are never sent, monitoring social media for any sign of the missing person's continued existence, and more painfully, their apparent well-being without you. This stage can persist for weeks, months, sometimes years, particularly when no closure is ever offered, because, as established earlier, the mind cannot close an open loop. It can only exhaust itself trying. Here I want to introduce a concept that explains why even highly successful, intelligent, self-possessed individuals are not immune to this. Often, in fact, they are more vulnerable to it. Success and intelligence create an internal narrative of control. I understand my life, I make good decisions, I am not the kind of person this happens to. When disappearance strikes such a person, it does not simply produce heartbreak, it produces a crisis of identity, because the experience directly contradicts their internal sense of competence and control. This is why you will sometimes see remarkably accomplished people behave in the aftermath of a significant disappearance, in ways utterly out of character, because the wound is not simply emotional, it is epistemological. It shatters their model of how the world and their place in it is supposed to work. There is also a physiological dimension that cannot be ignored. Research into social pain has demonstrated that the same neural regions activated by physical injury are activated by experiences of social rejection and abandonment. This is not metaphorical. The brain, in a very real sense, processes the sudden absence of an attachment figure as a form of injury, triggering stress hormone responses, disrupted sleep, diminished appetite or its opposite, and impaired concentration, symptoms indistinguishable. In many cases, from clinical anxiety, this is the terrain that those who wield disappearance strategically are operating within, whether or not they understand the neuroscience behind it. They are, in effect, inflicting a controlled injury and then, if they choose to reappear, positioning themselves as the source of relief from a pain they themselves engineered. This dynamic, when repeated over time within a relationship, produces what is sometimes called a trauma bond, an attachment made more intense, not less, by the cycle of pain and relief, until the relationship itself becomes organized around managing the anxiety of potential future disappearance rather than around genuine connection. I want to be direct with you here because this is where dark psychology tips over from observation into genuine danger. A person trapped in this cycle will often defend the very person causing them this pain, will minimize the pattern to friends and family, will construct elaborate justifications for behavior that described plainly to a stranger would be instantly recognized as manipulation. This is not stupidity. It is the mind's desperate attempt to preserve coherence in a situation that has become psychologically unbearable to see clearly, understanding this interior experience. The disbelief, the reconstruction, the obsessive pursuit, the neurological reality of social pain, the trauma bond that can form from repetition is not merely academic. It is the beginning of defense. You cannot protect yourself from a mechanism you do not understand. And so, in part 5, we turn from understanding to something more difficult, recognizing when this tactic is actively being used against you in real time before the trap fully closes. Knowledge without application is merely trivia. So let us move from the historical and psychological to the immediately practical. How do you recognize, while it is happening to you, that disappearance is being used as a tool of control rather than occurring as an honest byproduct of circumstance? The first signal is rhythm. Genuine unavailability, someone truly busy, truly overwhelmed, truly going through something difficult, tends to be irregular but explicable, and importantly, it tends to resolve with communication rather than mystery. Strategic disappearance, by contrast, follows a discernible rhythm once you step back far enough to see it. Withdrawal precisely at moments of increasing closeness or vulnerability, followed by return precisely when your engagement begins to cool. If you chart the pattern over time, and I encourage you quite literally to do this on paper if you suspect it is happening to you, you will often find the withdrawals cluster suspiciously around moments when you expressed need, asked for commitment, showed vulnerability, or simply began to feel secure. This is not coincidence. Security is precisely what the strategic disappearer cannot tolerate because your security threatens their leverage. The second signal is the absence of resolution upon return. When someone disappears for legitimate reasons, illness, crisis, overwhelm, their return is typically accompanied by explanation, acknowledgement, and often apology because they understand even implicitly that their absence had an effect on you that deserves address. The strategic disappearer, by contrast, tends to return as though nothing happened at all. Breezy, warm, sometimes even mildly wounded if you express hurt about the silence, subtly reframing your reasonable reaction as neediness or overreaction. Watch closely for this reframe. It is one of the most reliable markers of manipulation. The shifting of blame from the disappearance itself onto your response to it. The third signal, more subtle, is what I call the calibration test. Pay attention to whether the length and intensity of the person's absence seems to correlate not with their own stated circumstances, but with your own behavior. Do they disappear longer when you seem unaffected and reappear more quickly when you show visible distress? This correlation, if you observe it over multiple cycles, reveals something important. The disappearance is being used, consciously or not, as an instrument for measuring and manipulating your emotional state, rather than as a simple byproduct of their independent life. The fourth signal is your own physiological response, which I would encourage you never to dismiss as mere oversensitivity. If a person's absence produces in you a disproportionate spike of anxiety, checking your phone obsessively, intrusive thoughts, disrupted sleep, a felt sense of dread specifically tied to their unavailability. This is worth taking seriously as data, not as weakness. Your nervous system is often faster and more accurate at detecting manipulation than your conscious, rationalizing mind, which will happily construct excuses for someone it wants to trust. The body frequently knows before the intellect is willing to admit it. Now, let me offer a crucial caveat. Because dark psychology, applied carelessly, becomes paranoia, and paranoia is its own kind of prison. Not every absence is manipulation. Not every silence is strategy. People get busy. People withdraw when overwhelmed, not to control you, but because they themselves lack the emotional resources to manage connection and crisis simultaneously. The skill you are developing here is not suspicion of everyone who is ever unavailable. That path leads only to isolation and exhausting hypervigilance. The skill is pattern recognition over time, distinguishing between an isolated, explicable absence and a repeated, unexplained cycle that consistently benefits one party's power at the expense of the other's peace. Here is a practical test I would offer you. Ask yourself honestly whether, over the full history of the relationship, absence has ever been discussed openly, honestly, and resolved to mutual understanding, or whether it simply recurs unaddressed, treated by the other person as beneath explanation. Healthy relationships tolerate direct conversation about needs and patterns. Manipulative dynamics resist this conversation, often through vague deflection, mild ridicule of your neediness, or simply repeating the cycle rather than ever addressing it. I would add one final uncomfortable point. Sometimes, in examining this pattern honestly, you will discover that you yourself have used disappearance this way. Perhaps unconsciously, perhaps deliberately, perhaps only once, in a moment of hurt or self-protection. This is worth sitting with rather than dismissing. Dark psychology is not a taxonomy of villains and victims. It is a set of mechanisms available to anyone, wielded consciously by the calculating and unconsciously by the wounded, often producing identical effects regardless of intent. Self-awareness here is not comfortable, but it is essential, because the same nervous system wiring that makes you vulnerable to another person's strategic absence is the wiring that could, under the right pressures, tempt you to use the same tactic yourself. We arrive now at the most important question of all. What do you actually do once you recognize this pattern operating in your life? The first and most crucial principle is this: the antidote to someone else's disappearance is never your own increased pursuit. Every instinct in your body, wired by millions of years of attachment biology, will scream at you to close the distance, to reach out again, to seek reassurance, to ask what went wrong. Resist this instinct with everything you have. Pursuit in the face of strategic withdrawal does not restore balance. It confirms to the person withdrawing that the tactic is working, and it will therefore continue indefinitely because you have taught them through your response that your engagement is guaranteed regardless of their behavior. The second principle is the cultivation of what I call your own gravitational center, an internal sense of value and direction that does not depend on any single relationship's stability to remain intact. This is not a platitude. It is a practical discipline. It means maintaining your own ambitions, friendships, and sources of meaning robustly enough that any one person's absence, however painful, does not create a vacuum in your entire identity. The person who has built this center is, paradoxically, far less susceptible to manipulative disappearance, not because they feel nothing, but because their sense of self does not require the other person's constant presence to remain stable. And here is the deeper irony. This quality, a person who does not collapse in your absence, is precisely what genuine, healthy attraction and respect are built upon. The very independence that protects you from manipulation is also what makes you resistant to being taken for granted in the first place. The third principle is directness. When you observe the pattern I described in Part 5, the correlation between your vulnerability and their withdrawal, the absence of explanation upon return, the reframing of your reasonable hurt as neediness, name it. Calmly, without accusation, without the defensive heat of an argument, simply describe what you have observed and ask for clarity. I've noticed that when I express how much I care, you tend to pull away, and then things go quiet for a while without explanation. I'd like to understand what's happening. This single act, direct, unemotional naming of the pattern is disarming to a manipulator in a way that emotional pleading never is, because it signals that you have moved from reactive participant to conscious observer. Manipulative dynamics depend on the other person remaining unaware of the mechanism. The moment you name the mechanism aloud, its power over you begins to erode, regardless of how the other person responds. The fourth principle, and perhaps the most difficult, is the willingness to let the relationship end rather than chase it indefinitely. This is not cruelty toward yourself, though it will feel that way in the moment. It is the ultimate expression of the gravitational center I described earlier. If, after naming the pattern directly, nothing changes, if the disappearances continue, unaddressed and unexplained, you are left with a choice that ultimately defines whether you remain a participant in someone else's power dynamic or reclaim authorship of your own life. This choice is rarely comfortable, but I have observed across countless historical examples and countless individual lives that those who eventually walk away from an unaddressed pattern of strategic absence do not merely survive the loss. They frequently discover on the other side of it a clarity and strength that the relationship itself had been steadily eroding. There is a final, broader lesson here, one that extends beyond any single relationship. In observing the dark psychology of disappearing, in every historical figure from Talleyrand to the modern manipulator, in every cult leader and courtesan and cold executive, you begin to see a single unifying truth. Those who master the rhythm of presence and absence are not, in the end, masters of other people. They are, at best, temporary managers of other people's insecurity. True power, the kind that endures beyond any single manipulative tactic, comes not from making yourself scarce and not from making yourself endlessly available, but from becoming a person whose value is so evident, so intrinsic, that neither presence nor absence needs to be weaponized to secure it. This is the deepest irony of everything we have covered. The tactic of disappearing works only on those who have not yet built an unshakable sense of their own worth. Build that, and the entire mechanism, the withdrawal, the silence, the calculated return, loses its grip on you almost entirely. Not because people will stop trying to use it, they will. Human nature does not change. But because you, standing on your own center, will simply no longer be the kind of person for whom absence creates devastation. That, in the end, is the only real protection against the dark psychology of disappearing. Not vigilance alone, not counter-strategy, but the quiet, unglamorous work of becoming someone who does not need to be chased in order to know they are worth staying for.